Go.
Hi everyone, my name is Connor Gallagher. Today we're going to talk about my research question. Does political affiliation affect one's view on the death penalty? Firstly, this wasn't my original research question. My original research question was actually, why does the death penalty the law of the land if there's so many positives to abolishment? That was kind of hard to make into a research topic essentially, because it was such a broad question and there was nothing really being measured. It was more of just like a personal statement, I would say. So I decided to move into this because this was something I could easily measure with variables and create a survey to display exactly the correlation between political affiliation and one's views on the death penalty. Next, we're going to get into the literature review a little bit. So this is just, some of the articles I read. I'm going to talk about 8 of the ones I've read. First, we're going to talk about a factual perspective on capital punishment. What this did is it took 2 data sets from the 1990s and the 2010s on support for capital punishment, and showed how, over time, more people have been supporting the abolishment of capital punishment, like the author once. And even he mentioned, what I thought was very interesting, that some of the countries with the highest execution rates in the 90s don't even have capital punishment as an option in their judicial system anymore. So essentially there's a moratorium placed on it. One of the ones he mentioned specifically was Russia. Russia, until basically the Soviet Union dispersed, was huge on using the death penalty for controlling those who opposed its views in the nation. But now, in the 2000s, they placed a moratorium on the death penalty there, and it was no longer allowed to be used as punishment. Next, we're going to talk about Symposium, Furman's Legacy, New Challenges to the Overbreadth of Capital Punishment. This article took a look at how the death penalty was being given out indiscriminately and violated case precedent and constitutional amendments. First off, we're going to dive into the case precedents, and we're going to talk about Furman versus Georgia. The case Furman versus Georgia was the original case that placed the moratorium on the death penalty in the United States. The Supreme Court found that the death penalty was being handed to those who are of African American descent much more often than those who are of white descent, and I have some more about that later on in some other articles, so I'll touch on that a little bit more. And then also I pointed out how it violated the 8th and 14th constitutional amendments of equal protection. What equal protection basically is that every person needs to be charged the same way, depending, no matter what they are, like their race, their ethnicity, their sexual preference, anything like that. And it was basically put in state to help alleviate discriminatory sentences. Next, we're going to talk about nature, nurture, and the capital punishment, how evidence of genetic environmental interaction, future dangerousness, and deliberation affect sentencing decisions. This looked at the MAOA genotype. What this is the part of your brain that metabolizes dopamine, serotonin, and a few other, what we know as the happy chemicals. So it looked at the amounts and how fast this genotype was working, and it found that those who had a lower genotype of the MAOA receivers were more likely to get harsher sentences, and if they were allowed to bring in this MAOA genotype into the mitigating factors, it actually ended up reducing their sentence. Perceived future dangerousness, pretty much if there was a high perceived future dangerousness, those sentences were more harsh, but if it was perceived that the person was not a danger to anyone later on in life, the sentences were much lower. And then finally, they also looked at child maltreatment, which is, child abuse, child malnutrition, just any kind of not taking care of a child. And they showed that if this childhood maltreatment was allowed into the mitigating factors, and what mitigating factors are, just in case you don't know, are any factors that reduce the likelihood of retaining a death penalty sentence. Next, we're going to talk about Kentuckians' attitude on capital punishment. The study looked at 2 surveys, one from 2016, one from 1989, and used certain parameters to show who does and does not support capital punishment. The biggest thing that I thought was really interesting from this article was it found that the most likely Kentuckian to support the death penalty was a male conservative Kentuckian, and then the one who was most likely to not support the capital punishment was an educated male. We're going to continue on the literature review. We're going to talk about the public opinion of capital punishment and intersectional analysis of race, gender, and class effects. This study looked at all the factors listed in the title in 8 different combinations. Those combinations were such as black educated male, black uneducated male, white educated male, white uneducated male, black educated female, black uneducated female, white educated female, and then white uneducated female. It found out that in all cases where there was a black individual, they were less likely to support the death penalty than someone who was of white descent. They found out generally women are much more likely to support the death penalty. Women are much more likely to support the abolishment of the death penalty than those of men. And then class effects, they found that if you are educated, you are much more likely to support the abolishment of death penalty than someone who is uneducated. The historical evolution of the death penalty, abolition as a fundamental human right. This didn't help a lot as far as the study went, because this was more of just a look at how death penalty abolishment has gained support over time. Next, we have valuing black lives. This is one of the ones that made a case for ending the death penalty. This is one of the ones I was talking about earlier that goes more into how black people are much more likely to be receiving the death penalty. They're actually 5 times more likely than a white defendant to receive the death penalty. And then this is Ohio Modern Death Penalty from Architecture Opponent. It's written by Ohio Supreme Court Judge Paul Pfeiffer. He was one of the first originals when the moratorium was placed and it got reinstated with Gregg versus Georgia, that they wrote in the law for Ohio's death penalty. But now he is completely against it. And in this, he just kind of talks about how he went from supporting it to now seeing all of the human right violations and just ethical violations that are being with the death penalty. Next, we're going to talk about qualitative or quantitative research. My research actually is definitely better represented as quantitative and observational data. Quantitative data is essentially any data that has numerical value to it. The main reason I think that would be great is because I'm wanting to use a survey/questionnaire to figure out where the person is on the stance of death penalty, and then where the person is on the stance of political affiliation. On top of that, I would use a statistical comparison between the literature review, so all the stuff I found already, and then my survey question to show the correlation between how conservative someone is, or how liberal someone is, and their stance on the death penalty. As I already said here, statistical correlation between political affiliation and the death penalty support. We're going to talk about the operationalization of variables. Political affiliation as a dichotomous variable. First off, a dichotomous variable is any variable that has only 2 certains. So essentially like a yes/no question, but in this political affiliation example, it would be Democrat or Republican, and then they would choose whether they identify more as a Democrat and Republican, and I would use that to separate them into 2 groups so I could measure how someone's Democratic views or Republican views affect their approval of the death penalty. The independent variable, now this is the one that the investigator manipulates. So this would actually also be a political affiliation, because I'm seeing, depending on if they're Democratic or they are Republican, how that affects the dependent variable, which is the support or non-support of the death penalty. In this case, who am I sampling? First off, I have 2 samples. As I mentioned, I'd have the literature review of just all the data sets they already have for me, comparing stuff and trying to show how people have moved more and more towards the abolishment of the death penalty. And for my survey/questionnaire, I'd use convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is a type of non-random sampling where you just essentially ask anybody who's close to you, or anybody who is the most convenient or simple to ask, and you use that data, and I would compare that data to what I already found in the literature review, as I've already mentioned. And then next we're going to go to what new knowledge will this contribute? The main thing I'm hoping to contribute with my research would just basically increase the understanding of how political affiliation directly affects one's views on the death penalty. As of right now, at least in my literature review, there was no definite study that focused on political affiliation. So I definitely want to dive more into that and just show, like, oh, when someone is more conservative, they are more likely to do this, and when someone is more democratic, they are more likely to do this. As far as like new knowledge, I can't quite say until I actually complete the research, but that is my hope for what my research would contribute to what has already been shown as a increasing improvement of the abolishment of capital punishment. How does it compare to existing data about your topic? The aforementioned, there's no study in the literature review that only looks at political affiliation. There are some that bring that into accordance, so there are other parameters and factors, but no one looks directly into that. My study's purpose is to support abolishment, like all the articles in my literature review. We're all very pro-abolishment of the capital punishment, so I would want to get that point across and let people know that based on political affiliations, we shouldn't let that decide the law of the land. If half the people don't like it and half the people do, I don't think it should be a law. The articles in my literature review are all focused on multiple parameters or constitutional issues, while mine, as I've mentioned, is mostly just focusing on political affiliation and comparing that to whether someone is likely to or not likely to support the death penalty. I believe these articles show the positive increase in abolishment. My study would as well, as I've already mentioned. Everyone, it seems to be around the U.S., is increasing in their support for abolishment of the death penalty and decreasing their support of keeping the death penalty. And then it is similar to other data sets, like the few ones mentioned where they mention older data and they compare it to new data. My hypothesis, I believe that those who identify as Republican are much more likely to support the death penalty than those who identify as Democrats. How did I come to this? Why did I come to this? Mostly, if you look at largely Republican states, such as Texas, that is statistically and more normally Republican and red, they have the most executions than any other state in America. And also, if you look into a Democratic state, such as New York or California, there is no death penalty in some of these states. So that kind of proves to you, oh, look, the leaders over here are Democratic. They aren't very supportive of the death penalty. They have even enacted legislation to get rid of the death penalty in their states. Now, Republicans, on the other hand, they are trying so hard to keep reinstating the death penalty and keeping it in place no matter what, because they think it's the best deterrent for crime. So what? So why should you care about my research? The main thing why you should care, and the main policy I'm trying to see impose, would definitely be the abolishment of the death penalty. Now, this is probably going to be hard to do. I don't know if my research alone would be enough, but hopefully my research in combination with the other ones would give a good case for the abolishment. If we can't get the death penalty abolished, then what? I would kind of want to make the guideline discretions that were given in Gregg versus Georgia a little more direct, because the whole reason those things were in place was to reduce the discrimination in the death penalty, which obviously has not done, because to this day, blacks are way more likely to get the death penalty, and then depending on the race of your defendant, the race of your victim, my bad, if the race of the victim is white, you are way more likely to get the death penalty than you were if your race of your victim was deaf. So if we can't get it abolished completely, at least make it so these poor people are not getting death penalty in such discriminately. How to spread the word? Now, I would send my study to journals, hoping to try to get it published. If we couldn't get it published, I would share it with other criminal justice professionals and see if maybe they have some ties or something they can help get it into a journal of some site. And then, as I already mentioned, I would try to make policy changes if I could get it to that step, maybe get it to some lawmakers, get it to some legislators, and see if they could impose something. And then finally, the current examples, the most two important ones to me right now are Amy Coney Barrett's election and the effects of a 6-3 majority. As I was mentioning, political affiliation has a huge effect on how people view the death penalty. And now that we have such a high conservative majority, it definitely seems that the death penalty is going nowhere anytime soon, and there may even be some reinstatement in certain states. We don't know. We'll have to see how that affects it, but I definitely am curious to see how her election into the Supreme Court of the United States will affect the death penalty. And then finally, COVID-19 has affected the death penalty astronomically, as people have not been getting put to death because most trials are being pushed back because they can't have people in there due to social distancing. And also, executions have just being postponed as they don't want to risk anyone's condition. You know, like these executioners don't want to be there, the prisoners don't want to be there right now. There's chance of transmitting COVID to one another, and they can't risk that. Also, another interesting thing about COVID-19 and the death penalty is they've been trying to get some death penalty medications in effect with COVID, and they found some are effective, not as nearly as effective as the viruses that have been developed, the vaccines that have been developed, but it definitely has made a difference. That's everything. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Have a good one.
I bet.
Oh, that was long as fuck, actually.
Yep, 15:50.